Hi, my name is Joe Jackson. I'm an interviewer and a broadcaster, and what you're about to hear is one of the 1,400 interviews I did for major media outlets in Ireland. But many were done for the print media, recorded on cassette tapes, and so some are, let's say, sonically challenged. But sonic considerations should sometimes give way to historical significance, I believe. And I'm glad to say that some of the powers that be in RTE Radio 1 agreed with me on this, and broadcast between the years 2015 and 2018 many of my interviews in a series called The Joe Jackson Tapes Revisited. What follows is the first in a two-podcast series based on one of those radio shows, which itself was based on an interview I did in 1996 with Father Bryant Darcy, who apparently was one of the inspirations for the TV series Father Ted, although to see him in only that sense would be ridiculously reductive and an insult to the man. Either way, the radio show was broadcast twice, once in 2016 and for a second time 2 years later. And on that occasion, one Irish newspaper picked it as a radio highlight of the day and said about the show the following. During his 1996 Joe Jackson interview, Father Bryant Darcy revealed for the first time that he was sexually abused. He was highly critical of the laws of celibacy in the Catholic Church, claimed that his spiritual training was life-denying, and that he needed to relearn a version of goodness. Jackson says, I'd forgotten how truly soul-searching Darcy was, more so than I had space to allow him to be in the original magazine interview. 2 years later again, I stand over all that, and listening to the tape again, I was reminded that back when I was 17 or so, I attended a school retreat, stayed back for 2 hours talking with the priest whom I described in my diary as hip, if only because he'd played music by Bob Dylan and Simon and Garfunkel. But more to the point, it was the first time I identified about myself, as I put it in my diary, I love going this deep into things, talking about God, life and spiritual matters with a priest or whomever. So I guess this interview, nearly a quarter century later, was me bringing it all back home. By the way, if you want to read the complete article, it's available at joejacksoninterviewer.com. Hi, welcome to this edition of The Joe Jackson Tapes Revisited. But first let me say this, sometimes when I revisit tapes I made over a roughly 30-year period as a so-called celebrity interviewer, I am left speechless. That's me speechless. More seriously, the truth is that when I played after not hearing for 21 years the 4 hours of tape I made in 1996 with Father Bryant Darcy for a hot press interview, I was startled by how truly soul-searching he had been. Far more so, in fact, than I had space to allow him to be in the published interview. This was particularly true in terms of the last cassette tape we made, actually here in RTE, in a relatively quiet corner before Darcy was due to do a guest slot on a radio show. That tape really does sound like he was making his first, if not last, confession, and could just as well be a near monologue from Beckett's Waiting for Godot. By the way, Father Bryant Darcy in his 2006 book, A Different Journey, said that during this interview I became the first journalist to ask him outright if he himself had ever been sexually abused. You'll hear that exchange, but what you won't hear is Darcy telling me the details of each incident of abuse, the first of which occurred when he was a boy, the second when he was a seminarian. That part of the interview was off the record and not on tape, though Darcy did give me permission to leave in at least the reference to the fact that he had been abused. Tellingly, one reason he was reticent to go public in more detail on this subject was that his image as Father Trendy might lead to some people saying he was just jumping on the bandwagon at a time when tales of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church were rife. Hearing Darcy tell me this made me even more determined to try and undo his ridiculously reductive image as Father Trendy, something that already was my goal. So to kick off, I purposefully, provocatively said to Brian that this image probably struck many young people in particular as not only patronising, but also alienating, if not pretty abominable.
I was never that keen that I was a Father Trendy, to be honest with you. And those who know me are and there are quite a number of people who would know me, would be very good friends. People who worked hard with me in parishes, in spiritual programmes, in all the other sort of stuff, would know that I was never, ever a Father Trendy. Secondly,
But what does that phrase connote to you?
Father Trendy means that he's jumping on every bandwagon, and that I mean, for example, that you were on like talking about songs and stuff like that. I never did an outlaw of any description ever.
Right, okay, but you made the entertainment industry your ministry.
That is because I was a fan of the industry, not because it was a ministry. I wasn't mixing the two in that other sense.
But were you trying to bring the people back to God through music? You know, like Dolly Parton might claim they do in country music. They have another agenda. That's what I think some people fear.
No, I don't. I mean, there was a stage when I most certainly did feel that pop music was saying something that I listened to a lot, and maybe was saying something that I could preach a lot, and particularly from the times of Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel. And it was reflecting what young people were thinking, and it was not necessarily the same message as the church was saying at the same time. And certainly it was bringing up women's issues, and it was bringing up abortion, and it was
like
bringing
who?
up
Paul Simon, singer-songwriters.
Singer-songwriters throughout the you know, Helen Reddy was bringing up a lot of stuff later on in that stage about women's issues.
Well, I Am Woman, and
precisely that sort of stuff.
Feminist anthem.
And it moves through it. I mean, and Dolly Parton and to a greater extent Loretta Lynn was too.
But Dolly Parton was too.
For their own place. I guess Dolly Parton.
Those songs about young women abandoned because they became pregnant. They were very forward-thinking. But did you ever get in trouble for the fact that some of those songs were definitely espousing an ethos or a cause that were different than the church's?
I give you a straightforward example of it, Joe. The first time I became editor of The Cross was a couple of months after I was ordained. And the first issue of The Cross for November 1970, front cover of The Cross was the Beatles and their influence on young people. And it was banned by the censor. The censor in the Archbishop did not want that to be on the front cover of a religious magazine. And if you go back, it was on every single paper at that stage that a religious magazine would dare to put the Beatles on it. And that was when I did my
Who
first
wrote the
radio.
article? Was that your article?
I did.
And what were you saying, that it had influenced them in terms of drugs?
Yes,
attitudes?
I was more popular than Jesus' ethos.
You carried through that line?
I was saying that, and I said to a great extent that was a true statement.
All right, well, I can understand why that was. Poor old John nearly got burned in Memphis for that one.
So
you're bringing that one.
I think what the guy said was true. He wasn't claiming to be greater than Jesus. What he was saying was, I probably am better known than Jesus Christ throughout the earth. And that is probably, maybe, I don't know, but it certainly had a deeper ring of truth in it.
Well, one incident, before you go forward on that, there is a book that's just come out called Revolution in the Head about the Beatles. And it roots the success of groups like the Beatles. It takes very seriously that comment. And it says that the popularity of groups like the Beatles, forward through to Presley, to Prince, to Jackson, that all these people are almost substitute gods in an age where science has atomized the idea of Christ.
I would buy that. I would buy that as a very good political, or not as a very good philosophy that could be held. That's all I'm saying. You would argue and disagree or agree with it
as to whether those people should be seen in those terms,
and exactly, or what they would even think of it, or whether you can bring it to its logical conclusion. There is an element of truth which not necessarily is a full truth.
Right, but you did say that the reference I said to you where Elvis changed Pink Cadillac, you may have religion to Pink Cadillac, you saw rock and roll becoming a new religion. And there are many who see it in those and sell it in those terms.
Well, maybe so. I would say it may be a new liturgy rather than a new religion.
Okay.
I'm not
fair enough, but define the difference for me.
I think it's where people come together. Liturgy is where people come together and get in touch with, because they're in a communal experience, get in touch with the greater power. Now, that's really the advantage of it. Really is essentially what the Mass or a religious service should be, where I don't sit at home and pray on my own, but where I come together with brothers and sisters. And because we can do that, there's a spirit or an expression, a communal expression. It's why you have liturgical dance. It's why you have liturgical movement. It's why you have liturgical music. It's why you dress up for it.
But a lot of people going to see U2, and Bono himself has said that he believes that when he does it, the greater force they're gathering together to celebrate is Bono, and that makes him fearful. Yes. And it's U2. Yes. They're not aspiring beyond that to a God force.
Exactly, but I'm not saying that isn't also true. What I'm saying is what people experience there is, and I would look at how young people where young people feel at home and feel loved and feel wanted, and where young people feel free to express themselves. And I think if I'm not looking at that, I have no right to be trying to communicate with young, different or old. And I'm also finding a little of myself in that. I'm not sort of bringing the idea of me sort of trying to bring people to go through music. It could be true, but for the idea of me trying to be trendily interested in music just to bring people to God is not true, and never was true. I was first of all a fan.
By the way, before this interview began, Bryant Darcy and I had discussed the cultural sea change signified by the fact that in 1955, Elvis, in his recording Baby Let's Play House, changed the lyric line, "You may get religion," to "You may have a pink Cadillac." So I asked Darcy, who was born in Fermanagh in 1945, attended the Christian Brothers Grammar School in Omagh, St Michael's College in Enniskillen, and who studied scholastic philosophy in UCD, as is evident from this interview, to tell me more about his years growing up as a pop fan.
It would have been what, 60s music? Late 50s, early 60s?
Mainly 60s music.
And I've interviewed someone like Paul Durkin who said he discovered Heartbreak Hotel, and then the priest of the bishop or somebody told him this was the devil's music and the shadows came in and it was sexual and you should not be sexual.
They told me that all
Did you
the
have
time.
to go through all that stuff?
Yes, very much so. And priests, I was taught by priests at school who kept telling me these things were wrong. And I mean, I remember at home as a young fella in a very small country 2-roomed house in Bendelec with a tin roof in it. I studied and did all my studying listening to Radio Luxembourg in my ear through the 50s and right through the until 63.
But did you have moral problems dealing with the suggestion that rock and roll was the devil's music and that it was too sexual for Irish Catholics to be opening their hearts to?
At the very time that I was saying that, there was a rule in our diocese which said it was a reserved sin to go to a dance that did not end at 12 o'clock. That was the kind of thing we grew up in. But still, we were going to bands, and I had been at school in Omagh with fellas like Pat Chestes of the Platinum and Brian Call, Frankie McBride, Ray Moore, Rob Strong. All those guys were fellas that I grew around with, and I said, well, there's nothing wrong with them. Do you know what I mean? And there was nothing wrong with me either. And when I wanted to be a priest, my father said, "You will never be a priest." He did not want me to be a priest.
Why?
Because I was too interested in music. He said, "No." He said, "That doesn't really look at the priest."
At what age were you when you first articulated the desire to be a priest?
I didn't. It was not I who articulated it first. Actually, it was. I went into confessions one night, as was the regular custom at that stage, and the priest in the very monastery that I'm rector in now. One of the old priests there was a Father Angelo, which was an awful name for any man to have, but they took names like that at that stage. And it looked like Angelus to me, so I presumed somebody had dropped an O or a U or something along the line. And in the middle of that anyway, he just said, quite out of the blue, he said, "Did you ever think of becoming a priest?" And I was about 16 at this stage. And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, I think you should." I said, "Why?" Well, he says, "I think you're good enough." I said, "Well, nobody ever told me that I was good enough to be a priest." Well, he said, "Come down to me next week," and I said, "I can't because I'm playing in the county final," which I was, of Gaelic football. Well, he said, "Will you come the following week?" And I would get up on my bicycle and I cycled the 5 mile, and I saw him the following week, and I did. I would have been basically, I wouldn't have been a rebellious young fella in that sense. But I mean, I was the black sheep of my family at that stage, you know.
Had you lived like a boy of 16 would in relation to sexual experience, drinks, any of that?
Not
in those
drinks,
days?
No, not drink. I suppose
girlfriends?
Girlfriends, but innocent.
In those
girlfriends.
days, it would be
it was innocent.
kissing and holding
exactly, precisely. Going to school and on the way back from school, and maybe going to dances, and maybe you know, there was no cars or anything like that. But I was going to dances.
Had you been in love or anything as a teenager? I'd imagine.
I wasn't a teenager in love, but I wasn't in love.
Right. Singing Dion's song.
Exactly, and you know, of course you were. And you know, every young one in the convent school. I mean, you were mad about them. I meet them now, the grandmothers. And it's a chastening experience.
But did you, when you had to make that, that decision?
Exactly.
But I mean, part of the problem still for a lot of them, we'll obviously deal with it later in more detail, is the question of celibacy, the question of giving up all those girls that you had crushes on. Was that even a consideration back then, or was it not?
Looking back on it now, it really wasn't a consideration. I have got to say that, and it is one of the things that I would object to in my own training, that it didn't become a consideration until much later in life, when probably it would have been too late if I hadn't been lucky enough to have well-adjusted friends, if I hadn't been lucky enough to be at a time where I could go and get myself readjusted by doing refresher courses, by doing group work with people, by being psychologically advanced, and by trying to bring some bloody balance into my life. And I'm talking now in 1980 when I began to do this, and have been doing it very seriously ever since.
That seminal subject of how Bryant Darcy needed, circa 1980, to unlearn, as it were, some of the more morally dubious and spiritually corrosive aspects of his religious training, is a subject to which we would return during our final tape. But at this point, Brian wrapped up this part of our chat by focusing again on his image as Father Trendy.
I, at any stage, was never in the church's book a trendy. I was never acceptable in the church. It was when I became a parish priest, I was objected to by the Archbishop. He did not want me to become a parish priest.
Why? Not because of what?
Because I was too outspoken. B, I was not loyal to the church. And C, because I seemed to be a populist guy.
Bryant Darcy, who became a novice at the Passionist Monastery in Enniskillen in 1962, a year later was transferred to Mount Argos in Dublin, ordained a priest in December 1969, and 3 years later became, he says, the first Irish priest to join the NUJ. So I asked Brian if, back when he started writing his column in the Sunday World, he was bound by, say, church restrictions.
They tried to, but I did not do it. When I was editor of The Cross, it had to go through a censor each month. And a number of them caused great problem. But one was an interview I did with Bernadette Devlin in 1972-73, in which she gave a wonderful explanation of how Christianity had failed and how socialism needed to be tried within the church. And she came out with that immortal phrase that immortal thing. And she proved quite, to my satisfaction at least, that the Catholic Church here in Ireland had almost deliberately set up a situation where priests who might have a rebellious or revolutionary nature were fobbed off into religious orders.
You mean abroad?
And therefore abroad.
Oh, and
abroad.
Yeah, right.
Whereas because they had brought in a rule, actually, where unless you had attended a diocesan seminary for 2 years, you couldn't enter Maynooth.
Okay.
Now, that wasn't going to get a bus conductor's son in. It was going to get a middle-class fella in. And this is her theory, which I had.
But that's the same kind of hierarchical structure that many find offensive within the church, political or otherwise.
Yes.
And particularly socialists or the left-wing analysts throughout the 60s and 70s.
And she maintained, that Irish priests had revolutionised Africa and South America, but had never got a chance to do it at home.
All right.
At this point, Brian Darcy explained to me why, the year before this interview, he hadn't felt it would be right to celebrate in Ireland the 25th anniversary of his ordination. So instead, he went to work for a year in South Africa. A report in the Irish Times had suggested it was because he'd been so disillusioned by revelations of paedophilia in the church. I asked him if that was true.
Was it because you were so upset by all the revelations about Ryan, by the paedophile priest? Smith?
No, not at that stage.
Because that's what the Times suggested, that you told friends there is nothing to celebrate in being part of the priesthood when all this is breaking at the same time.
That's not why, but that is not why I went.
But that's why you didn't celebrate. That's why you didn't feel the urge to celebrate.
When I come back, people still want to celebrate, and I said absolutely under no circumstances, and there was no celebration, not even in my own parish.
But because of that, did you feel so disillusioned?
I felt so disillusioned. I did. I felt so disillusioned, and I said, how would I feel if I had been abused by a priest, or if a family in this area been abused by a priest, and see this fella come in and having a big slap up thing? I mean, that really is
you having a big slap up meal,
a slap up meal, or celebration, or people saying what a good for, or whatever you are, or photographs in the paper of the latest thing. I mean, there are times when you must have the decency not to celebrate.
But it wasn't a rejection of the priesthood and saying, I don't see anything to celebrate.
Yes, it was rejection of the priesthood that people perceived. Do you understand what I mean? This triumphalist priesthood. And I was saying, no, I'm not getting part of that. I don't want to be part of it, and I'm not part of it.
But was your own perception being polluted too by all this?
Mm-hmm.
Your own commitment, your own love, your own faith.
Yes. I've no doubt about that, and still is, Joe. I mean, I'm not saying that there was some magic formula which eradicates this. This is a painful journey.
Yeah, I saw you say that and I was saying this to that it's great to see the systems falling down, but so many people are traumatized by the fall. That it's just we can't deal with it. People can't. A lot of people. My mother can't deal with it.
Yes.
She couldn't deal with the whole. I mean, be it Brendan Smith, be it Casey, and Father Michael Cleary, your friend. The whole three happening together. She's 67 years old, and it's very much taking the whole thing right out of her guts.
Well, I mean, I don't. I think they're the people that I feel, and I don't mean that again, I feel desperately sorry for good people like that, because they have given a life to it. They have stood against wayward sons not shouting at them, and possibly husbands shouting at them, and they have taken flack.
That's true.
For a long time.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, I mean, they had at least the idea that right was on their side.
Yeah.
Now that's gone.
Yeah. Which is a hell of a loss.
But I mean, that is hell.
It is hell.
Is there any other
the very
definition
certainties you grasp throughout your life.
Can you think of any better definition of hell than that?
No.
And I think that's what hell will be, as a matter of fact.
Right.
And all of the things we clung to that thought would see us through, they're a puff of smoke.
But how many artists have I interviewed, like Christy Moore and that, who say that the loss of faith in another process led them to clasp so deeply onto Guinness or drugs or whatever, that the loss of that certainty is a pivotal experience in anybody's life. And I would agree with you that the older the person, and I don't mean just my mother, I mean people who have fashioned their souls on a particular set of values for their entire lifetime, to have it suddenly whipped from under them is like...
How do you do it? I mean, what happens after that? I mean,
were you ever abused as a child? Were you ever close to being abused?
Yes, I was, but I mean, that's not for publication.
All right, you were.
Because that sounds like I'm just jumping in a bandwagon.
But why wouldn't you want to go public about it? Even to only say, yes, I was, but I don't want to talk about it any further. It doesn't sound like boasting. It sounds like I know I have compassion for this because I was in there.
Yes, well,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, if you want to run it, but I don't want to head in on hunt press out because that's wrong.
I promise you, I will
that's
look.
Not
no,
what it is.
You know, so it's
you're
kind
not
of
the first one who said it to me. Many people have said it to me. Like obviously, you're saying things so right that obviously you were. And so I'm not going to deny that. I'm not denying it because of shame, because I have in my own community and I have dealt with it and I have said it.
Right.
So I mean, I have said it publicly. In that sense, my own religious community, that is.
All right.
But it seems too much like misread because of my history as being seen as a father trendy.
Oh yeah, well, that's out of the way in the first questions you answered. No, I'll handle this as delicately. I will not.
It might be just read.
But to me it gives more validity to what you're talking about.
I did, of course, honour that promise to Father Bryant Darcy. Next up, we discussed what had been his relatively recent and hugely controversial appearance on a particular Late Late Show, during which Darcy argued in the presence of Cardinal Daly that the Church was largely perceived to be out of date and lacking in compassion.
You said it spot on. I said not that it is, but it's perceived as lacking in compassion, out of date, and
exactly
the structures, about the structures.
Exactly. And I still can't understand why, but obviously it just put words on what people had either been afraid to think or were thinking and couldn't put words on.
Did Cardinal Daly say in any way, tone it down?
No.
It would be best if you didn't. Because what you were also calling for was an open debate.
Absolutely.
You were saying, let us discuss these things in public.
He didn't. And that was what annoyed me. That's why I had to say it, because I had said a few things in the earlier part of the program, which I actually think are more important. Of the arrogance of the Church saying that people who live together have to be living in sin, or the fact that people were, that the Church leaders were dismissing anxiety and anger with the Church and putting it down to paedophilia. I was saying I'm maintaining the paedophilia is the excuse people use for a latent anger at the Church anyway, because of decades of repressive clericalism.
Yeah.
And I think
in
that's...
the broadest sense.
Yes, and I think that's what has to be looked at. Right. Not just how do we get over paedophilia, but you're going to look at how does Father X react when I go and I'm living with a girl in the parish and I look for my child baptised. How does Father X go when he knows that we've been living together for 2 years and we go to him for marriage? How does Father X react when I have made a genuine decision, I've made peace with my former wife, and I'm now in a new relationship with the person that I know can't be blessed formally by a church, but nevertheless I know I'm at peace with my God? How does Father X react when I go up for Holy Communion? Sure. And I'm looking at how does Father X react with the running of the local school and the appointment of teachers? Now we're getting into nitty-gritty stuff of repressive clericalism that has caused much of this anger that has now found a very legitimate way of expressing itself in anger against paedophiles.
But you can see why the community and society in Ireland has hooked into the paedophile thing.
Oh, sure, and rightly so. I mean, we have to get that out of the way. We have to make sure that we repair the damage, and we have to make sure that you can't say that it's never going to happen again. because families will tell you that. They've done their best in families. I mean, families have been dealing with this for centuries, and certainly very much so in the last decades.
During this next part of the interview, you may hear a kind of bleed through from a previous recording on the cassette tape, but what Darcy said is way too important to be silenced by a slight technological flaw, especially given that the church has since censured him publicly, in a sense that to me is highly flawed, theologically speaking. Either way, Darcy at this point told me he'd always tried to undo the notion that guilt and shame are good, and that the only way to get to heaven is to suffer.
And well, again, I'll use the word perception. There's a perception that guilt and suffering and all those things are good.
Yes, I agree, but I've spent my life trying to say that is not true.
All right.
I've spent my life saying it's not. I mean, if a woman comes up to me tomorrow and says I've had a miscarriage, that's how I began the article last night. And for eons I've been doing it. If somebody comes and says my child has died, I'm not going to say it's God's will.
All right.
Flip me. Sure, I don't think it's God's will. When my nephew died, I was ferociously angry with God. And I was saying to my sister, Marie, you have a right to be angry with God about that. Please don't try and say that is God's will. It's not God's will. God doesn't want that. But it doesn't mean that we can't somehow
So how do you explain it to yourself or to your family?
The only way I can explain it to myself is that evil and suffering and life in general, I don't know the answer to them. All I know is I know enough about God in my life to know that He'll walk with me through it. Now, where He's leading me, I don't know where He's leading me, but I know that it will be that He won't abandon me.
Do you not feel at a moment like that He has abandoned you when
yes,
the death of a child or the death of a young person?
Absolutely, but then didn't Jesus on the cross say, my God, why have you forsaken me? So, I mean, it's a perfectly normal spirituality to have. But
the doubt and the questions are surely part of faith.
Yes. How can you have faith until you have doubted?
All right. When was the moment of deepest crisis for you in terms of maybe coming close to just believing there is not a God?
It happened a few times. It happened a few times in me. Not just one. It would happen a few times. I would say when I was dealing with a family and the fourth member of the family committed suicide. And I'd say, this, that's pretty close to despair. I would say...
Like as in, how can God allow this?
I would say that the day the bomb went off in Enniskillen, I doubted if there was a God that day. So at moments of that, it's not personal stuff that makes me doubt God. So far,
When's the moment when a personal stuff made you absolutely? Because somebody told me that I didn't see you with. Was it Jerry Ryan or was it Jerry Ryan? That you really seemed to be close to leaving the church and wanting to have a child and wanting to marry. Are those personal?
I would hope so. I would hope so, Joe. I mean, I would hope that I would still be thinking of those things, and that's not that because I'm wanting to do them, I'm looking to do them, that I'm going to do them.
But is it not a result of the past year where the whole thing seems to have fallen in around you?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say. I wouldn't say it's just a result of the falling in around me. No, I would not. I wouldn't say. I don't think it'd be fair to do that now, because fair to put that on. I think I have to own something myself.
Fair enough.
Do you understand what I mean?
No, but I did see the suggestion that the church's position in terms of celibacy when it comes to was that really upset and disappointed you.
But that totally flummoxed me, and still does to this day.
Why? What's so?
Because there's absolutely no reason for compulsory celibacy. It is a mean man-made law that has something to do with property in the Middle Ages and has nothing to do with human development now. It has nothing to do with the first pope. It had nothing to do with for 1,000 years of it. Compulsory celibacy I'm talking about.
I know.
And it has nothing to do with anything today other than a mean little rule about nothing.
But do you hope it will be changed?
Of course it will be changed.
You think it will be?
Of course it will be changed.
Sooner rather than later?
Well, and in church's terms, sooner could be in 50 years.
Hi, Joe Jackson here again. And I thank you for listening to part 1 of the Joe Jackson Interviews podcast, Father Bryant Darcy. The full interview, as I said, is available at joejacksoninterviewer.com.